Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Wednesday, November 9th, 2022. Time for another show. Nothing happened as far as I'm aware. By the way, does this whole Election Day thing depress Eastern Orthodox turnout if we've all voted before Eastern Orthodox Election Day? I don't know. With early voting, maybe it's not nearly as bad. Maybe that's the concession we've made to them. Okay. Well, as I mentioned in today's opening post, if you happen to have had a look at that, I'm not 100% sure how to proceed today. I don't know if I know how to do the day after an election show when it hasn't been an abject disaster. But we'll try and find a way to stay positive generally, given that we have no experience with this type of show. Now, the 2020 election, of course, was a big success, but, there were doubts about exactly how things were going to come out with, the whole... I don't think we knew that there was going to be a riot at the Capitol just yet, but there were already inklings, of course, and they were insinuating that the election had been stolen. And now we have to try and figure out how much air is left in the tires of the election denialists this time. I've spun out the doomsday scenario. And if you like, if this is the sort of thing you're used to, and you need a little bit of doomsday scenario today, we'll be happy to construct one for you probably in the second hour of the show, because the reality comes first. Greg Dworkin, of course, has rounded up the stories and what numbers are available, and he's been telling you all along that it might very well go something like it did last night. So, we're still not sure. There's still counting to be done. Could still end up being a nightmare. Could end up being a nightmare without my nightmare scenario. Just plain old, too many Republicans win races, and there was no stopping it. But of course, as Greg set it up for you in the last week or two prior to the election, it became pretty clear that, ordinarily you would expect, historically speaking, tremendous losses for Democrats. This was, in fact, a historically strong showing by Democrats when there's a Democrat in the White House and they're facing midterm elections. So there's all sorts of interesting dynamics to try and parse this apart, but we're still in possible, red light territory. Of course, it was, I think most of those in the predictions games were still saying that it was very likely that the House would go to the Republicans, and it may yet, but it's still so close that we don't know, and there might be a little bit of nightmare scenario mixed in there, because it's looking like the House will be extraordinarily close. If Republicans do manage to take it, we're talking about like by 1 or 2 seats, possibly. But there's still probably, 20 to 30 seats that they haven't quite determined who's going to win yet. So you don't even know. There's too many moving parts to try and map it out. But it is possible. It definitely sets up some weird dynamics for the House Republican Conference. We'll definitely have to talk about that. Kevin McCarthy as Republican leader, does he have the support to win the gavel even if Republicans do take over the House? That's a big if. And then we'll find out exactly how many true believers there really are in the election denialist camp. I think a lot of them defected last night. There were a lot more, to their credit, there were a lot more concessions from losing Republican candidates than I thought we would hear. And that's good news. But there are definitely some of the denialist types who are out there who will have a hard time accepting, if they ever accept their loss. Lauren Boebert, apparently, on the bubble. So we'll look forward to hearing about, 1, her defeat, and 2, her whining about it. But that's the kind of candidate that is, I suppose, as likely as any to show up on January 3rd and insist that voter fraud cost her her seat, and they therefore should reverse the decision made by the voters and presumably certified by the state authorities in Colorado. But her friend Murdery Trader Green, of course, will still be there. Her friend Matt Gaetz will still be there. Her friend Madison Cawthorn lost his primary and isn't going to be there. And the guy who was the haircut that was supposed to replace him lost too. That's great. Do they have the energy and the numbers to come to D.C. on January 3rd and say that the Democrats cheated in Colorado and Lauren Boebert is the true winner, and we may have just enough votes to muscle through a reversal? But then on the other hand, there'll be Republicans in the conference somewhere, a few of them, who will say, the only thing I really learned from the election was this denialism thing is killing us and we have to get away from it as soon as possible. No, the denialist caucus can't be allowed control of the House Republican conference. And then do they fight it out? Do they put up their own speaker candidate? I don't know. And we'll never know until that time arrives. So just as we don't really know what Greg is going to talk about until we give him a chance to speak. So we'll do that. We'll open the box. We'll see what happened to the cat. Good morning, Greg. How are you?
Good morning. So really, the thing that died last night was narrative.
Aha. Yes, definitely. That's definitely the case.
You know, Dave Wasserman said, well, that was the craziest election night I've ever seen. And people pointed out to him, well, that's because you were played.
Yeah, a lot of people were way wrong, and that's great.
Long live early vote hopium.
Yeah, right. Oh, I was
Those guys were right.
Simon
Rosenberg and Tom Bonnier, who we've covered on the show.
Yes.
Turned out they were not overly optimistic. They were actually, not only were they telling us what was going on, but they pointed out, both of them very early on, you know what? Trafalgar and all those other Republican polling firms, they're trying to push the narrative. They're full of it.
Yeah. Well, that didn't go very
They
well
were,
for them.
and they are.
Okay. All right. Hang on a second. I'm going to poke my head out and see that all is well with the student who's supposed to have left for the bus. You go ahead and tell people what happened. I'll be right back.
So I'm going to tell you a little media narrative from Jeremy Littau, who's a media sociologist. He says he's a journalism professor at Lehigh, and he says, I'm not like a regular media sociologist. I'm like a cool media sociologist. That's what it says in his bio, so it must be true. And we pointed out that as an example of the kind of narrative that just has taken hold of DC media types, Politico had a poll, which actually came back good for Democrats just on the eve of the election. And so what happened? They wrote a story and a headline, voters appear ready to blame Democrats for economy and inflation, even though their congressional ballot had Democrats up by 5, 48-43. And what they wrote in the story is voters often treat midterm elections as a referendum on the president and his party, which suggests that support for Democrats is on the wane, and many polling averages indicate that voters are more inclined to vote for Republicans. The Politico Morning Consult poll, our poll, is an outlier on this question, showing support for Democratic congressional candidates 5 points above support for Republican candidates.
Oh, well.
So even though our poll says what I'm about to tell you is nonsense, I'm going to give you the nonsense anyway, because like everybody in Washington is saying it.
I don't want to be the only one not saying it.
And we don't want to be the only one not saying it.
Right, except you do, really. You want to be the one out there telling them what's going to happen and be looking like the genius. But no, I guess not.
Right. And so, Jeremy Littau looked at that and said, it's ridiculous. And for example, he's in Pennsylvania. We're waiting on a nail biter in my district, Pennsylvania 7, one of the most 50-50 districts in the country. Susan Wild, the Democrat, 149,588 votes. Lisa Scheller, the Republican, 144,875. For those of you keeping score, that means the Democrat is ahead. And what happened here, and I think the person that first pointed this out is, some of the nonpartisan analysts who were really good about this, basically saying, look, we have these numbers of seats that we're saying are lean Democrat or tilt Democrat or safe or whatever. And then we have these number of seats which are lean Democrat and tilt lean Republican, tilt Republican. Nathan Gonzalez, I think, was the one that pointed this out. And we basically got all those right. And so far, of the 10 seats that have been decided, it's broken 8 Democrats and 2 Republicans. So put all this together with what we always say about elections.
What do we say?
There's in a close race, it's not unusual for a lot of the undecided toss-up votes or seats to break in one direction. What I'm saying here is the narrative was, okay, we have an idea what's going on, but there are enough toss-up seats, both in the Senate and the House, that we don't really know who's going to win this election. And we have generic ballots that say the Democrats are ahead and that they've caught up with enthusiasm.
Enthusiasm. Wait. Yes.
Enthusiasm.
That's the one.
Like in the Wall Street NBC poll, and it's all there. The data's all there. And what we don't know is we don't know what's going to happen with the toss-ups. And people in Washington had their pre-existing narrative, and they didn't futz around with the lean D or tilt D or lean R and tilt R stuff. They simply assumed that the toss-ups would break the way their narrative says. That's why Morning Consult Politico people writing that up said what they said. Had they stepped back and, like Nathan Gonzalez said, they're toss-ups because we don't know, it would have been a completely different narrative and it wouldn't have been such a shock. But they didn't, because they had their narrative to push, driven by Trafalgar and Real Clear Politics and other polls that were just trying to game the system. And they got played, like Dave Wasserman. So now, Tim Alberta, who's a center-right journalist, but a good one, was looking at this last night early, and he said, this is not a red tsunami. In fact, it might be shaping up as the best midterm cycle for an incumbent president's party since the rally around the flag election of 2002.
Okay.
We all remember that one.
Yes.
For context, Republicans flipped 13 House seats and 9 Senate seats against Obama in 2014, and they had already flipped 63 seats in 2010. And Democrats may well lose both chambers tonight, as you were saying, but there's no sign of a national wave like there was in 14. Nothing like it. Even if they wind up losing the House and it turns out to be a 10-seat majority, which isn't enough for Kevin McCarthy to control the Marjorie Taylor Greens in his caucus, in his conference, whatever they call it. And, even if the Senate winds up doing the same, although right now it's looking more likely that it's going to be a 50-50 Senate or even a 51-50 Senate if Democrats wind up winning a runoff in Georgia, which if they have a 50-50 Senate by having kept Nevada, would happen probably because, why is Republican, going to gear up for a 51st seat? It's one thing if control matters, and it's another thing for what's already a 50-50 Senate. What's the difference? So, the Democrats are in pretty strong position, and really the narrative people didn't see it coming, but the polls all said, we don't know what's going to happen. It's too close to call. Had they looked at the data and simply went with that, they would have been in a much better place, in a much better shape than the ones who said, well, let me give you this story about how I spoke to all the Republicans who are convinced, David Wallace Wells did this, that they're convinced that it's going to be a bloodbath for Democrats, and we'll write it up. Why Republicans are so confident about a red wave. That didn't happen.
Yeah, right. Well, that's true. Although, oddly enough, a lot of people circulating this morning's, I guess, print New York Times top headline, which was interesting enough. As everyone a little annoyed about it. GOP collects early wins in pivotal vote.
Congress hangs in balance as Democrats defy expectations, says the Washington Post.
Oh, hey, that's
Trump-backed Republicans fall short in several key races.
Yes,
that's
what's
going on here.
Another key issue, too. People pointing out it was
big loser Donald Trump. Big winner?
Yeah.
Joe Biden.
True.
Joe Biden, who
even
everybody made fun of. Joe Biden, who everybody hates, apparently.
Oh, he's
the
least
Joe
popular.
Biden, who everybody knows his approval rating is going to drive this election. What happened to that story?
That's a good question. And now the end result is, looked at objectively, historically powerful midterm performance. No Democratic incumbent president has approached
ever done this before.
So pretty quietly doing the amazing thing here. The other thing I noticed others observing, it was there were places where Republicans did amazing job in trouncing their opponents, namely Florida, and pretty much only Florida. And that's an interesting dynamic all by itself. But as someone was pointing out...
Well, South and Southeast, because white voters don't like Democrats.
Well, that's true. But, Florida stands out, I think, even among its neighbors, in how well their Republicans performed. And someone did point out that it was the Republicans who Trump likes the least, or is even in open warfare with, who did the best in terms
Brian
of
Kemp and
their performance.
DeSantis, Ron did something or other.
Yeah, right. Even Rubio. People that have been targets like for outright hostility from Trump, and very recently at that, who actually performed the best. And the list of candidates that he sometimes enthusiastically, sometimes out of some weird sense of obligation, endorsed around the country are the ones who got trounced or maybe squeaked by if they were incumbents. And that's an important thing for them to digest, but they don't usually digest it.
Right. So let's look a little more at narrative here. What I was pointing out is if you've been following it right up until the election, it really had, I guess, 2017, was it? Ed Gillespie vibes.
Yeah. Okay.
Crime,
yes,
inflation, crime,
say.
caravans, crime. Oh, the Republicans are making a last-minute move. All the momentum is in their favor. Democrats get depressed, and Republicans are elated, and they expect to win, and it turns out they actually lost by quite a bit. Feels exactly like that. So crime, inflation, crime, caravans, crime. How about Dobbs? How about January 6th? How about lunatics running in too many places? Because that's what the voters said.
Yes, that's true. And also a couple of important victories for Democrats who were being criticized earlier. Oh, the Democrats played in the Republican primary and elected the craziest Republican. Well, first of all, Republicans did that. We've straightened that out. But those lunatics very frequently lost to those Democrats.
Right. Kevin Robillard has a nice story about that in Huffington Post. Democrat Hillary Scholten wins election to U.S. House in Michigan's 3rd, and he says, and with this race call, every single Republican who won their primary with help from Democratic meddling has lost in the general election, including Don Baldock.
Yes.
Who, if you recall,
right.
New York and New Hampshire were in terrible trouble because they were making Ed Gillespie in their direction moves in the last few days, which everybody in those states knew, even though the polling didn't say it, except for Trafalgar and Insider Advantage and all the other Republican game the system polls.
Yes.
And it turned out it was all bullshit.
Yep. Well, there you go. Everyone knows that. It was fun to see that analysis emerge from you have to dice and slice the data every once in a while. Michigan, by the way, fantastic performance electorally across the board, up and down the ballot for Democrats.
Yes, they're going to take State House.
Yeah.
And they're going to take the governorship, and it looks like they're going to take another bright spot around the country is secretaries of state, because it looks like all the elections tonight, Mark Fincham in Arizona, and Michigan, all those, they're going to lose.
It's really something, and remember that Michigan, that too was
Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, the important ones.
Yeah. All the places that the nightmare scenario was if they take, over the Secretary of State position in these 5 states.
Yeah, including the governorship in Pennsylvania, who appoints the Secretary of State.
And that he lost too, and convincingly at that. So great night for tamping down on denialism and maybe, I guess, overall on Trumpism. But I'm thinking of Michigan and the way Trump used to cheerlead for the free Michigan thing during the COVID, the reaction to the backlash against COVID restrictions. That was one of the bright lights in that universe. And it looks like the next election around, minus I guess the next midterm election around anyway, once it had sunk in how much damage had been done and how crazy these lunatics really were. And they tried to kidnap the governor along the way. Yeah. And, you know what? Turns out that, it leans pretty hard Democrat after all. And, there was a good article about the kids at the university standing in line for forever to cast those ballots. So a good turnout from the youth vote that everybody had question marks about. Some of the kids staying in line for 6 hours to cast their ballots. late into the night. So,
all true, all of it.
Pretty
Dave
amazing.
Weigel had a nice take on the whole big thing here. He said, listen, the midterm message is pretty clear. Voters want more crime and completely open borders.
Yes, right, sure.
Well, they must, because,
Apparently.
Republicans campaigned on it. That's all we heard
Right.
here. Crime, crime, crime. We heard Dick Blumenthal here in Connecticut is responsible for fentanyl in the schools.
Yes, I'm looking
and
forward to
Johanna
that.
Hayes
Prices
wanted
of
to open the
fentanyl
borders
dropping.
and let everybody in.
Yep,
and, of
yep,
course,
of course,
looks like those
yeah.
two people won here, along with the governor. And, by the way, the thing on the ballot about their early voting passed, so maybe Connecticut will someday get early voting. It's now
good luck to you for that.
constitutional to at least consider the issue, which is what was on the ballot.
Okay, complicated process, but all
Yeah,
right.
well, first you have to amend the Constitution to allow it to happen, and now you can pass legislation. So step by step.
Okay.
Another GOP opportunity in Indiana 1, trending toward the Democrat. Mervyn, M-R-V-A-N. Mr.
Hey,
Van,
Mervyn. Okay.
I think, is up. And Pennsylvania 12, Pennsylvania 7. I mean, it's just
Pennsylvania
everywhere.
6,
Democrats
5,000.
just did better and better and better. Dan Fruitkin, again, looking at the big picture here, our elite political reporters were partial to a Republican narrative because it insulated them from accusations of being liberal, which is their worst nightmare.
Yeah. I think that's a good analysis.
And another one of his readers said, there's another dynamic here. They're
There are a
partial
lot of
to a
those.
Republican narrative because it holds the attention of both Republicans and Democrats. Republicans won't listen to a Democratic narrative, and Democrats get mad at a Republican narrative, so that way you get them both.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of true. I mean, that probably explains a lot about it. The Republicans won't read a newspaper that doesn't talk about them in positive ways. And I guess
Democrats will always
can't
read a
stand
newspaper that talks about them in negative ways.
Maybe, yeah, they can't say
they'll
they're good
internalize
things.
it and say, oh, it must be true. We'll probably
Right.
lose.
I suppose that's it. Or, a more charitable way of saying it, I guess, is Democrats know, look, it's important to read the newspaper, although they may be wrong about that. Whereas Republicans say, if it doesn't have
let's
good
just
news,
admit that we're
I won't
bedwetters
read
by, tradition.
I guess so, except then we hear from the adult bedwetting community about how that's not okay to say that.
Yeah, I suppose. So Don Delavolpe, who's the IOP, Institute of Politics at Harvard pollster, who looks at kids, said
IOP.
Democrats lost votes of everybody over 40, just like 2020. The 18 to 24-year-olds went plus 25 Democrats, 25 to 29-year-olds went plus 32, 30 to 39-year-olds went plus 11, everybody over 40, who needs you?
Sorry, I voted for you
somebody
guys.
pointed out, does this mean that the knives will be out for the kids from the elders? And I looked at it and said, you got that backwards.
Yeah, there's more knives, I think.
I think the kids have more knives.
That's true. Plus, they can attach them
more claim on
to
it.
drones and fly them into us. So look out.
We won the election. We own the knives.
Yeah, okay. Well, a lot of narratives definitely looking
So R.I.P.
pretty
narrative,
terrible.
no question about it.
Yeah. Speaking of the kids, I don't know. This is a weird segue, but I'll say this. There's another kid. There's a couple of kids now in Congress, as it turns out.
Yeah, a Gen Z person.
Yeah, two, I guess, Gen
One
Z.
from Florida. Who's the other?
Well, it turns out that Bob Menendez Jr. will now be in Congress along with his dad. I remember Bob Menendez Jr. coming to his father's office and spinning around in
Is he
circles in
older
his
or
chair.
younger than Alicia Menendez?
Younger. So, I don't know I don't know whether he counts as Gen Z or not. I don't remember exactly. But I remember him as a little kid spinning around in his dad's, desk chair over and over again in 1994 or so. So now he's in Congress replacing Albio Sirius. So,
Spinning around in his desk chair.
yeah, right. Probably enjoying that a great deal. I would say, probably want to refrain from that when the constituents show up. But they may love your enthusiasm. I don't know.
I don't know. Maybe. So this is Politico reporting on what happened this morning in Playbook. Many of the plausible outcomes predicted by top GOP officials didn't materialize. They didn't happen.
That is correct.
There was no massive shift of the Hispanic vote toward the GOP. There was no surge of hidden Trump voters. There was no widespread takeover of deep blue House territory. I got to bring up Johanna Hayes in Connecticut 5, who looks like she's going to win, and Alan Fung, the Republican mayor of Cranston, lost in Rhode Island too, when he was supposed to win.
Right.
Seth Magazine
even
won
realize
that
that was
one.
happening, but
So New England stayed blue. So there was no expansion of the Senate map into New Hampshire, Colorado, Washington, where incumbent Democrats cruised to re-election. The governor of New York won easily. There was no red wave. Once again, Biden defied expectations at the moment he seemed destined for a catastrophic loss. This is Politico writing, because that's their narrative.
Yeah. I guess so. And you guys wanted to do the Let's Go Brandon. Well, he went.
Okay, well, Dark Brandon won. Just as he did when he resurrected his Left 4 Dead candidacy in South Carolina in 2020, just as he did when he resurrected his Left 4 Dead legislative agenda this past summer. You know what? Maybe you're underestimating Biden, guys.
I guess that's
You keep
possible.
getting it wrong.
I guess so. I'm also reminded now with the results of the Sunday show appearance from Hillary Rosen, was it?
Yeah,
who,
I'm so depressed.
Yeah, I'm a diehard Democrat, but I am not happy. We are doing the wrong things. Our messaging is completely wrong. We're so out of touch with where the people are. They've told us over and over again they want to talk about the economy, not this democracy stuff.
And it turns out, by the way, ignoring the data, the last NBC Wall Street Journal poll said what was the most important thing to people?
What was it?
Democracy.
Wow. And I guess they showed that it was. People are going to, I think, at some point, maybe, I don't know, they ignore wrong pundits all the time. But Hillary Rosen, she just because she's a huge Hillary Clinton supporter as well, to have lost that 2016 election and then to come back now in these midterms and 2-3 days before election day say, we're completely wrong. We're going to get our ass handed to us. We don't even know where the electorate is. And to be that wrong?
I don't think I'm hiring you to do anything for me.
Yeah,
but I might give your name to my Republican opponents.
That's possible. Or, whenever we need
a Democratic primary, I'll give your name to the people who I'm really trying to beat.
I guess so. You're playing in the primaries again, except the one you're supposed to be in. Well, it was an amazing and still unfolding night and now day, and we'll see how much juice there is left in the election denialism theme for Republicans. So many of them abandoning it already.
Yeah, we'll talk about some specific undecideds to watch for.
Okay, that's probably the next wise move. We'll do that. We'll do something wise next. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, the same guy who was just talking to you a second ago. Our Patreon subscription drive is still going strong, with over 175 monthly donors who help keep us on the air. If we've helped keep you going during the pandemic, why not return the favor and help us keep going so we can all be together for the next disaster? Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it easy to make secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for keeping you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. By the way, one other bit of, I don't know what you would call it, technology note. The picture that I put aside of the New York Times headline, just so I could share it with you all in the afternoon recap, comes, I found it on Twitter, and the tweet is from, Anil Kalhan, I think. Let me just open it up and make sure. But the thing that struck me, I didn't realize this until I put this in pocket here, was that it comes from Anil Kalhan, who I guess, I don't know, is he also including his thing, or maybe it come to us via this? He's got his Mastodon social address up there, and I was wondering, has a Mastodon toot, isn't that what they call it, broken through and circulated on Twitter? But I think he might have just put his
here's the
Mastodon name in his Twitter.
Everybody puts their Mastodon, and I have mine too.
I don't know if I have mine or not.
And the reason is that there are bots and little programs you could use that will look at your followers and
on Twitter
make a list, a CSV list that you can save on your desktop. Then you can bring it over to Mastodon and reinstall it, and now you have all your followers.
Okay.
But in order for that to work, you have to have Mastodon in your bio.
That's what's happening. Okay.
That's why people
Good.
are putting it in their bio.
Interesting news to note there. I didn't know exactly what I was looking at.
Since you brought up technology, that's why.
Okay, good. That's good to know. People, I think our listeners will want that. Wherever we migrate to, if we migrate, I don't know, maybe Elon Musk will, jump into the ocean.
Yeah, I got a couple stories about that too.
Okay.
Which we may get to toward the end. But I found that Nathan Gonzalez thing that I was referring to.
Right.
He says 44 of 83 competitive House races are called. They said that early this morning, like 5 a.m. Only New York 3 has broken against rating so far. That was a GOP win versus a Tilt D rating. So 10 of 20 toss-up races called 8D to R.
Okay.
And there's Colorado 3 and California 41 rated solid R, but they're at risk. Point being, there's a path for Democrats to hold the House. And my point was, the ratings guys pretty much got it right. Sure, there's an occasional surprise. But the vast majority of who they said leaned one way or leaned the other way are breaking that way. It's the toss-ups. And there were just a lot of toss-ups. And again, the assumption from Washington is, well, we'll all break Republican because we all know independents hate Joe Biden and that's driving the election. And it turns out, as I've said on the show, I don't know how many times, people are complicated. You can hold in your head the idea that I don't like inflation and I don't like what Democrats are doing with their being in control. On the other hand, I don't like what they're doing with abortion on the Republican side. And as far as inflation goes, they don't seem to have a plan at all.
Yeah.
And I'm going to take all of this and then add Donald Trump and democracy and January 6th. And you know what? I'm going to vote Democrat.
Yeah. I mean, it can.
Even though I hate inflation and I'm not so happy with Joe Biden.
Yeah. And I guess that they did. And I mean, an analysis that says there's this many toss-ups and the reason the toss-ups are going to go the Republicans' way is all of these things that you just said and all these assumptions about what people think about Joe Biden seems like, now it certainly seems like bad analysis. Whereas if you had said they're toss-ups and I don't know, because they're toss-ups, that's why we rated them toss-ups, but I can say that historically the White House's party loses seats. So if you're trying to guess how will the toss-ups break, that would be an okay analysis.
If you look at the independents, they're telling you that they don't like Joe Biden. And everybody knows how you think about the president is what decides these things.
Well,
except that's not true.
Yeah. So don't say that.
But everybody knows it.
But do say, well, historically, this is what happens.
The column you wrote 2 days ago that I read, and this guy said it too, so I'm saying it.
Although I guess if you say historically, this is what happens, and then someone presses, but why does it happen historically? Then you start making up reasons.
That's the thing.
And
that's what gets all of this. Why did Ed Gillespie lose? Well, it's because he ran commercials about caravans. That's not why he lost. That's why he made up ground. Well, how do you know? That's just something you say. I'm saying the opposite.
Yes, you're right. That's true. That's the spin war. All right.
Right? Why did Glenn Youngkin wind up winning the governorship in Virginia? And talk about Virginia governors because, it's isolated, right? Because of the way that you do it in off years, you don't have all this other stuff, so you get to look at the individual race. Well, why did Youngkin win? Well, it was all about Loudoun County and schools.
Yes. Let me tell you, by the way, Loudoun County says F UFO Chris Rufo and returns Jennifer Wexton to the House, no problem.
And, of course,
there's no red wave here.
Also.
Right. And she moved from the middle of the road to the middle of a different road. So that's fantastic. Good luck to her.
Unfortunately, Elaine Luria didn't return. She had a different district to run in and was redistricted out of her seat. But you know what? For the most part, the centrists did okay. And no, it's not because they turned their back on defund the police. Crime was not the issue. It was for individual candidates. We've talked about this ad nauseum. Mandela Barnes probably wasn't the best fit for Wisconsin for a variety of reasons, but I'm not sure they had anybody better. And he won his primary, so he gets to run. And he's doing pretty well against Ron Johnson, who's an incumbent. And right now, Johnson is leading by just a couple of points, but it's not a called race yet. So, Mandela Barnes did okay. And Tony Evers won in Wisconsin.
Yeah, right.
So defund the police didn't win everything for Republicans there. At the same time, it was never a great thing to run on, and then having to explain it and defend it is not easy. But people are complicated. And so, the thing about Glenn Youngkin is that you can say whatever you want to. He pretended to be a moderate and got away with it, this, that, and everything else. The fact of the matter is this entire election was probably driven more than anything else by everybody's frustration with the pandemic, and everybody understands there was no right answers. And at the time Youngkin was running, people were really mad about, having schools closed and the disruption that the pandemic did, and they had to blame somebody.
Yeah.
And Terry McAuliffe didn't exactly, focus on the things that people cared about.
I guess not, but yeah,
If you're
that
in
was
Virginia,
a hot topic then.
You can't ignore traffic, right?
That's true.
Especially if you're in Northern Virginia.
Yes.
And you can't. And
You'll
so
be
don't.
run over if you do.
And, if you're in the middle of a pandemic and people feel like schools have been disrupted, don't ignore that, or don't downplay it. Don't say stupid things that make you sound out of touch.
Right. But also realize that if you're going to then campaign on the pandemic is over, you can't campaign on that as your greatest hits the next couple of years. The people who thought that would contribute to a red wave found out people have mostly, I guess, either put it behind them or said, well, you told me it was over, so I don't care anymore.
Right. And that's what happened in Michigan, because Gretchen Whitmer, her biggest downside is how she handled the pandemic. But you know what? That's old news.
It is. And it's much older news, by the way, than Dobbs, which, the media attempted that Democrats peaked too early narrative as well.
Boy, did that fail.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
right. And of course, the other thing is the youth vote. It was funny. I was talking with somebody on Daily Kos, and they said, just parenthetically speaking, as humans do to one to another, and my following story has nothing to do with endorsing or validating a concept. But they were saying they had a dream that Nancy Pelosi was standing on her head, and, what does it all mean? And I pointed out, that there's this tarot card, the Hanged Man.
Yes.
But the guy hangs upside down. And it's believed to be symbolic of Odin's sacrifice to himself on the world tree for wisdom and insight into preventing Ragnarok. And what I pointed out is, according to the Edison exit polls, that's the primary reason 18 to 29-year-olds voted for Democrats.
Okay.
They wanted to prevent Ragnarok, and inflation came in second, and abortion came in third, this is what people care about.
This is the first generation in a long time that has probably overwhelmingly been able to correctly identify what Ragnarok is.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's media for you. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So,
Amazing.
It's people are complicated, and there's a lot of different things that go into why people vote the way they do.
Yes.
That's all I'm saying.
I guess you can't argue with that. Though you would want to, because you're complicated.
I got a good tweet from George Conway.
Yeah?
He says, now that we're done with fake red tsunamis, can we please turn back to real orange jumpsuits?
All right. That's a nice play on the color thing. I like it. I guess now we find it's now post-election. I don't know whether the DOJ cares what the results are or whether the election is over. That I'm not sure.
Well, I don't know. Now, here's the other thing. Kentucky voters rejected an anti-abortion amendment to the state constitution. Vermont validated abortion rights. Michigan validated abortion rights. I think California will do the same. And as Taniel wrote up, triumphant night for abortion rights and referendum.
That's right.
Now, that being the case, how do you turn about and say, oh, well, that Dobbs thing just didn't have the juice that Democrats said it would. Said all the older male Republican consultants who were unnamed for this story.
Yes. And now what? I think 5 states that have put it on the ballot.
I can't believe Democrats are making abortion their final closing argument. Guys, they did pretty darn well.
Yes.
And all of those comments about, well, Democrats just don't know how to do messaging. We're talking about, as you pointed out in your introduction, we have a situation where Biden's in the White House, the economy's not that great, inflation is high, you're expected to lose 40 seats, and you actually did much better. So maybe there's nothing wrong with your messaging.
That's the thing that we'll really have to figure out, because there was
an awful lot of
complaining.
There has to be something wrong with messaging, because first of all, we always say that.
Right. I guess that's traditionally what's said.
And secondly, it's got to be true because, I believe it.
Yeah.
It's not the way I would do it.
Well, I mean, there's always at least 2 centers to that debate among the pundits and consultants, and the out group of consultants of course, have a vested interest in saying that the messaging was wrong.
Right.
So
and
they
the
get hired.
unexpected result of this election yesterday completely validates my point of view that I've been telling you for the last 2 years.
Yep. It will be very interesting to see what they do to spin their way out of it. Because if they were the out group this time and they complain about not being hired and therefore the Democrats are going to lose terribly and they lose, but they don't lose, they win, or at least they vastly outperform expectations. I mean, presumably they're going to be the out group again the next time? I don't know. That's kind of weird. And people are complicated, so are candidates.
Again, if you want to go back and look at data and try to figure out just how much salience abortion issues had, get ahead of yourself and try to get a hold of the exit polls, which aren't completely accurate. We all know that until they're adjusted later. But just at least sneak a peek at the gender gap.
You'll want to hear that.
If you find it large, then abortion may have had something to do with it.
Could be.
And maybe, just maybe, especially if you're a guy, you should shut up and listen to the women's on this.
That'd be an idea. It's it's a thought. I'd recommend it. Yeah, I also saw a lot of very interesting.
Guys, you also might want to ask directions every once in a while instead of just assuming going. But that's another story for another day. I'm not, gonna.
All roads lead to somewhere, I guess.
Exactly.
So and I've always wanted to see Rome. Let's go. Sure, I'm lost,
Rome,
but
New
it's
York,
a happy accident. Right.
You can get there from here.
It can happen. Lots of very interesting observations, mostly from people poking their heads into the Twitter timeline to say, hey, how about that whole last couple of weeks where you told me my issue was going to kill Democrats, and it actually seems to have saved
how
us.
about them dogs?
Yep. Pretty amazing. And some good observations, people like that. And I just randomly, Irene Carmon, I see with that comment, popping my head in from COVID town and parental leave just in time to watch people act like they weren't preemptively blaming abortion rights advocacy for everything before any results even came in.
Right.
Quite true. And lots of other similar observations about, blaming it on, like you said, the defund the police thing, or preemptively deciding that we were going to lose, and so therefore screw all the various members of the Democratic constituency, the black voters, the youth voters, they're all losers, except as it turns out, they saved you again. So maybe...
why don't you blame white voters? Why don't you just come out and blame them? Because
you should just do it.
That's what's going on. Michael Arrio is pretty good about this.
Yeah.
Stacey Abrams lost, right? It's because black men wouldn't vote for her? No.
No. Oh.
It's because white men wouldn't vote for her.
That's a problem. Well, I talk to white people fairly frequently. I don't know. They're not listening to me sometimes. This group that we have here is listening pretty good, though, but probably not because you're white.
So Dave Wasserman has a different perspective on his favorite topic.
Yes.
His handle on Twitter is redistrict.
Yes, right. I guess that would be his favorite topic, wouldn't it? Redistricting.
Republicans wouldn't be slight favorites to win the House control right now. And we're talking about right now, the day after the election. We're talking right now.
Okay.
Slight favorites to win the House. Think about that. Let that sink in.
I don't understand.
Gives you an idea of how well Republicans didn't do yesterday.
Okay.
Kevin McCarthy figured that in the afternoon he could announce he's the new speaker, and then he said, no, we'll do it at night. And then night comes and he says, you know what, we'll do it in the morning. And the morning comes and you can't do it yet.
Yes, right. That's true. That was the big nighttime story, was the number of Republicans who kicked everybody out of their victory parties without declaring victory.
Right. So Republicans wouldn't be slight favorites to win the House control right now if they hadn't been able to gerrymander far more states than Democrats. And Democrats wouldn't hold a slight majority today if the courts hadn't struck down GOP gerrymanders in Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Virginia in the last 7 years.
Okay.
So
it's a good counter.
For the House, this redistricting gerrymander stuff really matters a lot. And as a matter of fact, you could argue that if the Republicans do take the House by a small, slim majority, it's because Democrats screwed up in New York.
Yes, I did see that argument last night that while Republicans in, say, Ohio and I think elsewhere too, Alabama, was it, were ordered by the courts to redraw their maps, they just said, meh, we're just not going to do it. Whereas in New York, they were ordered to redraw
Like in
maps,
Ohio.
and they said, yes, let's do it. Right. Ohio and Alabama, I think, was what comes to mind. I'm not certain I have it right about Alabama, but definitely Ohio. Ohio very prominently just saying, what are you going to do? Make me? I'm not going to do it. I'm going to draw unfair maps, and screw you if you don't like it. The election's coming. You can't stop time, so here we go. And if it's a 1-seat, 2-seat majority, I don't see how you can't point fingers at the states that said we're going to do things unfairly, despite what courts say. Especially when there were states that said, "All right, fine, we'll comply." Democratic states where they could have presumably gerrymandered more seats. So I don't know. Yeah, that's we'll have to see how that sorts itself out too.
I haven't
just laugh
seen,
at
but I'm
McCarthy.
expecting to see soon. This whole election was because of legal weed. Nobody
That's
wants
true.
to talk about
They used
it,
to
but
say that. That was always a big theme afterwards. That hey, the states where it was on the ballot, the Democrats tended to perform fairly well. Why don't we put it on the ballot everywhere? And now, of course, it was on the ballot in a lot of places, and we did do fairly well. But there are so many other things that can make the same claim. All right, but yeah, I guess people are complicated after all.
Yeah, they are.
They want a lot of things, as it turns out.
That they do.
And gas is still expensive.
But gas
so
prices
what?
have in fact come down, and so
Yeah.
obviously the reason that the Democrats did so well in this election is because gas prices dropped, and that was because Biden emptied out the strategic oil reserve, and he did it for political reasons, and it worked, and so let's blame him.
Okay, right. Even though that was something that Republicans love advocating for usually and have done themselves in the past, but now it's bad.
It's terrible that prices are so high. Well, do something to lower them. No, you can't do that. You have an election coming up.
Generally, yes. All right. Well, that's. Well, people are complicated. They change their minds about
politicians are complicated too, except for the simple-minded.
things. All right. Well, let's see. Any other? Oh, yeah. I'm scrolling through my timeline trying to remember what else did people blame or say, hey, I thought you were going to blame the whole Democratic disaster on student loan forgiveness as well. That's another complicating factor that, it's going to destroy everything. We're going to look like, like people who care about Americans and want to help them.
Yeah, well, it turns out maybe student loans is why the kids turned out and voted for Biden, and so maybe you were wrong about that.
Maybe. So keep that in mind.
Right?
Helping
David
a lot
Austin
of people is a good
Walsh
idea.
writes on Twitter, Joe Biden pushed through limited student debt relief over the objections of older moderates in the Democratic Party.
Yes.
And was rewarded with the best first-term midterm results for a Democrat since 1978, fueled by the youth vote.
Ta-da.
The
Now,
reason why
did they
this is
feel
so
it for something
significant is we
else?
can look forward to a politics that centers the material concerns of young people,
Mm-hmm.
student debt holders, renters, women concerned about reproductive rights,
Yes.
in a way that's never happened in my lifetime.
Okay.
In other words,
mean-
hey, these are all what we used to call liberal values.
They're popular ideas, as it turns out.
They apparently win elections. Who
And-
would have thunk it?
Yeah, and as much as we, we appreciate the turnout of everybody who turned out, and it was great to see, and it may have made the difference. Well, I mean, in a coalition, everybody makes a difference. It just
Right.
That's the way the coalition works. So I
It
don't
could
know,
have been
maybe
Tom
they,
Bonnier, but apparently he put out different age groups and how they were voting and the
Yeah.
early vote, and we're killing it with over 100s.
are we?
I mean, we're just
it just
they
reverses
remember
itself,
World War
huh?
II, and we're just they really are Nazis, and we're just like cleaning up. Like there's 9 of them,
That's just muscle
but
memory.
we're really, really doing well.
Okay, well, that's interesting. So, like, youth vote, solid. Then the next age group up actually was even better. And then things were up, okay, till the 40s. Then all of a sudden it flipped. But then after 100, it
Until you get
flips
to be
again, huh?
95, after that, back to us.
Well, you got a lot of time to sit and think
All those
about
people
your
that
vote.
grew up under Reagan ruined everything.
Well, yeah. Now, Reagan would have been over 100 at this point,
He'd
wouldn't
be
he?
a Democrat.
So, yeah, there you go.
'Cause
See,
he's not a
things have
Nazi.
changed.
He made movies about Nazis.
That's right. And they were the bad guys in those movies.
Yeah,
So, he too may have the same muscle memory.
right. Our friend Tegan Goddard says, look out for this. Don't be surprised if Trump turns on Kevin McCarthy.
Well, of course, he never liked Kevin McCarthy. But
Well, everybody should turn on Kevin McCarthy.
That's right. Quite honestly, Kevin McCarthy has, in fact, turned on Kevin McCarthy in the past as well. I'm sorry he's, going to be disappointed, but it looks like these people cared about the election more than you, Kevin. I'm sorry.
Right. Stephen Rich, who's data editor for the Washington Post, also has this pithy observation. I don't think people realize how much Pennsylvanians really loathe New Jersey. Well, I'm from New York, so I think, yes. I get
This
it.
is unfair. You all loved it during The Sopranos.
Well, we love to hate it.
Yeah, I guess so. Should have our characters shoot you all then. All right. Well, at any rate, yeah,
It worked.
Pennsylvanians. Yeah, look.
Obviously, the reason Fetterman won,
I don't know
and by the way, this may turn out to be true. Early on, he defined Oz as being from New Jersey and not Pennsylvania, and Oz was never able to overcome that.
Well, he never moved. So, yeah.
That's the thing.
Yeah, that's not going to, it's not like, you can't overcome it because.
Well, it's about messaging. No, it's not about messaging. It's
real.
about the fact that he is from New Jersey.
Yeah. And they may not, I don't know, maybe they do loathe New Jersey. Everybody loathes their neighbors to some extent. But they definitely loathe people who say they're from Pennsylvania and hoping to gain the trust of Pennsylvanians, and they're really not from Pennsylvania.
Right. And, this is another thing I was having a discussion about with a insider from the Obama administration. Who was talking about the amount of money that's going into these ads and stuff like that. The ads in Connecticut were terrible.
Were they?
We've talked about how bad they were, right?
Oh,
but the point,
yes,
my
course,
point
I
is,
remember
he said that political science says that, no, this money really matters. And I said, I don't think it does. I mean, you could put a ton of money into trying to make somebody into something they're not, and it won't work. I mean, you can't make Oz from Pennsylvania. It doesn't matter how much money you spend.
Right. That's certainly true.
He is who he is.
Yeah.
Everybody knows who Fetterman is. You like him or you don't like him. Same thing is true with DeSantis. You can't spend money to change people. Youngkin was able to get away with it because nobody knew who he was. But once you know who they are, money isn't going to change.
Yeah, well, once a narrative sets in, at least it's more expensive to reverse a narrative than anybody's ever been able to collect in campaign donations. At the very least, we can say that. We don't know what happens at the extremes, like quantum physics, but maybe $35 billion, maybe $44 billion, and you buy Twitter, you can change the way people think of you. I don't know.
Well, Elon Musk told people to vote Republican.
Yes.
I'm glad he did, because it's like the Trump effect.
Yeah, right.
Oh,
that
really?
Worked out great.
You're telling me to vote? I'm absolutely voting Democrat now.
It was the wrong time. They were not happy about getting
Well, you
that,
should
I
pay
guess.
$8 and then vote Republican. And you should pay those $8 to me.
Oh, that
for
reminds me.
the advice I just gave you.
Why not? And you pay me $8 for listening, and then we'll just pass it back and forth, and we're hugely profitable now. I did see somebody noting last night also, put it in the museum, the pre-election House Republican, was the House Republican Conference maybe, the ones that tweeted out Kanye, Elon, Trump, or whatever it was. Yes. That's your closing message. How did you lose all those toss-up races? I can't figure it out. It must have been a very complicated series of machinations and moves about abortion and police. It could also be you're extraordinarily unpopular, and the only way you have even the most remote shot at winning anything is by essentially redistricting things and bending the electorate to your will through gerrymandering. But in fact, nationally speaking, your ideas are terrible and everybody hates them. Well, okay, those are the people you're looking to as beacons of hope and role models for the young people, Kanye and Elon and Trump, and everything. All three of them dies, and you picked the most amazing trifecta I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah, listen to me, fellow kids. I'm talking to the youngs here.
Right. So, all right. I think overall, we've certainly captured the mood.
Hey, you know
of
who
the
else
day
had a bad
after.
night besides Trump?
Oh, let's find out.
Tulsi Gabbard.
Oh, well.
All the people she endorsed.
Okay.
Not so good.
Well, it's the same as Trump, so, it's going to happen. But good, I'm glad she had that.
This ex-Republican thinks Obama shouldn't run for a second term for the good of the nation.
Okay.
That's a modern day version is Tulsi Gabbard.
Well, Well, good. I'm glad she deserves to catch as much blame as any of the rest of them. Right. I assume she thought she was going to be surfing that red wave. And
yeah, speaking of red waves, in this last 30 seconds, Stephen Portnoy writes, preliminary CBS News exit poll nationally. Which one of these issues mattered most in your vote? Inflation 32, abortion 27, crime 12, gun policy 12, immigration 10. So it turns out crimes and caravans don't win elections for you.
Okay. And the fentanyl didn't, the litter boxes didn't.
How do you feel about the Supreme Court decision on abortion? Dissatisfied, angry, 60% in the exit poll. Enthusiastic, satisfied, 37%. Which side do you want to be on?
I'll take, I don't know. Oh, yes, but a mention of the Supreme Court as well. That's another interesting line of analysis I happened to see Steve Vladeck picking up on and saying, obviously, well, we don't know what the House is going to look like, but if the Republicans end up, he's mentioning your point, but then expanding on it, if the Republicans end up with control by 7 seats or fewer, it seems like we ought to talk about how SCOTUS's orders in the Alabama and Louisiana cases make that happen. And not only the difference between Ohio defying their courts in gerrymandering decisions, but New York Democrats abiding by it. But over the past several years, a number of gerrymandering cases that have gone to the Supreme Court and have set us on this path. There were a number of states that were able to vote in gerrymandered maps that gave them the chance, Republicans, the chance to possibly hang on by the skin of their teeth and gain a majority. So, I don't know, it's more than just the last 2 years. It's been stretching back quite a ways. And a lot of backlash against what the SCOTUS has been doing in a number of issue areas, not just gerrymandering, not just abortion, everything.
Well, so it's 9:58 by my clock. I don't hear your music, but I'll
coming.
See you
10
tomorrow.
seconds.
We'll do it again.
All right. Yeah, we'll do the Eastern Orthodox Election Day, I guess. Music is coming up now. Here we go. There's our cue for that. It's weird at the top of the hour. We give away an extra minute. So we're supposed to use it for like informing people or entertaining them. But
daylight sounding time.
That's it. We forgot about that extra minute. And all right. Well, very good. Thank you, Greg. There's a lot to round up.
See you tomorrow.
We don't know what's happening. How's that? Okay. Great. Tomorrow we'll know. Thank you. And we'll look forward to it. And I'll be back in 2 minutes to fake my way through the rest of it. Oh, I'm sorry. 1 minute. I have less time than I thought. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I just remembered. Well, I'll have to remind myself to remember this again tomorrow. I meant to tell Greg what I told Joan yesterday about my own, purely anecdotal experience. I mean, it's my experience. I get to tell the anecdote of showing up for early voting and passing by a number of people both working at the polls and showing up to vote and wearing their Republican paraphernalia, T-shirts, essentially, identifying them as Republicans, but not wearing, vote Republican or not wearing T-shirts for the current House or other office candidates. I don't know what was going on. In my particular district, the only actual election race to decide on an elected official was the House race, but elsewhere, mayoral races or school board races, things like that. But they were, the Republicans were showing up at the polls in their Glenn Youngkin shirts, as opposed to in the shirts for their preferred congressional candidate, which I guess around me, I don't know I guess the entirety of Loudoun County is in the 10th district. I don't know. I guess so. But at any rate, that would have been the Hung Kao was the Republican nominee for the 10th district seat. Lost to Jennifer Wexton, of course, which is great news. But I would have expected to see more T-shirts for him, and really zero T-shirts for Glenn Youngkin because he wasn't running for anything that day. Ordinarily, so I thought that was interesting. It was like a declaration that there are people who were motivated to either come out and vote early or work at the polls to hand out literature to people who were coming to vote early were excited about being Republicans, not for the sake of boosting the candidacy of Hung Kao, but for their pride at having been part of the Glenn Youngkin wave, which is fading and which never really caught on here in Loudoun County anyway, despite the fact that they made Loudoun County the centerpiece of their election. Like I told you before, the first time when Youngkin won election from having made Loudoun County such a focus, that he lost Loudoun County, and that he, in particular, lost the districts in which these high schools at the center of the controversy were positioned. And remember, I mean, ordinarily, you wouldn't really look at election returns that way. You know, you'd kind of look at the county for a gubernatorial race, certainly, and say, well, I thought having made Loudoun County the centerpiece of his election, you'd think he would have won it. And interestingly, they used the same spin at that point, Republicans, saying, well, Youngkin performed better in Loudoun County than historical trends would otherwise have indicated, so maybe it was a resounding victory. But there were so many other resounding victories that actually carried him over the finish line, like in southwestern Virginia. It was probably more reasonable to focus on that. Besides which, it sounds weird, you know, well, he lost by less than he thought he was going to, or others thought he was going to. But actually, I think he got trounced fairly solidly. It was a double-digit defeat in Loudoun County. But like I said, ordinarily you wouldn't parse it down to the precinct for a gubernatorial race, I guess. But if you know, the reason I did that was because there was such a specific focus. It wasn't Loudoun County, you know, for Loudoun County's sake that he was focusing on us. He was making the reaction of the school board to the stories about, well, I guess the amplification of LGBTQ issues, which really didn't belong tied up in this story about parent protest, not over COVID restrictions, but over the rape in the high schools, where, you know, and then they piled onto that to try to turn that into an LGBTQ issue, very much the same way that they've attempted to make the made-up issue of litter boxes into an LGBTQ issue. It's just kind of the Chris Rufo approach to everything. By the way, I mean, that should be the next stage of analysis, is the total rejection of the Chris Rufo model, I would guess, in the outcome of these elections. Why didn't any of his culture war approaches do anything beyond the borders of Florida for Republicans? It works in Florida for various reasons, I guess, but elsewhere it was either overcome by events or just roundly rejected by the voting population. I'm not sure which. A little bit of both, I would assume. But yeah, so the precincts where the issue was, well, you got to listen to parents because look at what terrible things are happening to parents. Here's the example. The parents at Stonebridge High School, the parents at, I can't remember which other high school was involved in it now that I think about it, but these two precincts, the high schools and the precincts themselves share the same name, and the precincts in which the two high schools at the center of the controversy were located also lost fairly convincingly by Youngkin. I mean, there was more inroads by Republicans in one of those two precincts than you normally see, but they were still solid Democratic wins. And so, you know, I set about the task on almost all of November and December of 2019, reminding people, yeah, Loudoun County isn't the place that just, you know, put on a red hat and said, we're going MAGA now. It's the opposite. He was holding us up as the target. It would be like, you know what? I should have thought of this at the time. To come away with the assumption, as many people did, because, you know, it's a small-ish jurisdiction and nobody knows very much about it, and it made the news in this very specific way. But we were the target, not the catalyst for the change. The county didn't go for Youngkin by any stretch of the imagination. Even the parts most at the center of the concentration of fire didn't go for Youngkin. It would be like saying that San Francisco was the new vanguard of MAGA America because it had been attacked by every Republican candidate as, blah, 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 San Francisco values, and what are we going to do about this, and this is the place that really ought to be destroyed, and da, 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 da. And you can campaign all you want against Nancy Pelosi, but you'll never defeat her there, not that way, or maybe not anyway. But no one ever came away afterwards with, well, sure, Nancy Pelosi came back to Congress, but the Republican attacks worked and they flipped San Francisco. San Francisco's now the epicenter of MAGA America. No, of course not. Same thing with Loudoun County. That's the best analogy I can give you. And then they had the election yesterday, and guess what happened? Nothing doing for the Chris Rufo agenda in Loudoun County yesterday or in 2019. And at no point in the foreseeable future either. Thank you. And I'm done with the defense there. All right. Let's see. Now back onto other issues and other takes that I wanted to share with you. Along the same lines on the redistricting defiance, the first and still I think one of the better formulated statements on it, arguments on it, came from David Pepper, who, I have too many of his tweets open now. I can just go to one of them. His was the first one I saw dealing with Ohio, saying, I've worried for months that the House majority could come down to the fact that, 1, a court order striking down a New York House map done by Democrats was obeyed, the court order striking down the Democrats' drawing of the lines. They said, fine, we'll go back, we'll draw the lines differently and try and be fairer to the other party to be in compliance with the court. Meanwhile, a court order striking down the Ohio map drawn by Republicans was defied. If this comes down to just a few seats, Ohio's lawlessness could be the difference. That is an interesting comment and absolutely true. As it turns out, there are other states at play. That's where I mentioned Alabama earlier. Steve Vladeck taking the longer view of it, as I said before the break, saying obviously we don't know yet what the House is going to look like. And remember, I've spent the last week telling you it could be anything because nightmares can happen. But if the Republicans end up with control by 7 seats or fewer, it seems we ought to talk about how SCOTUS's orders in the Alabama and Louisiana cases helped make that happen. What's going on? He's pointing to this New York Times article appended to his tweet. The article from August of this year, August 8th, Michael Wines writing the article titled, Maps in 4 states were ruled illegal gerrymandered. They're being used anyway. So, a Supreme Court shift frowning on changes close to elections gives House Republicans a big advantage in November. They didn't make, much hay of it, but what if they hold on to win by just a few seats? Here's the story. Just to run through it. Since January, judges in Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Ohio, and I don't know whether it was since January that they did it in New York, but in New York, they went along with it. In other words, the Democrats, when they get a court order, say, all right, fine. The Republicans, when they get a court order, say, either no, or maybe we can get the Supreme Court to dump this court order. Since January, judges in Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Ohio have found that Republican legislators illegally drew those states' congressional maps along racial or partisan lines, or that a trial very likely would conclude that they did. So, that's just the nature of, they didn't have a trial to find out. They were looking for a preliminary injunction in some of these cases and got those injunctions based on the judges finding that probably if we went to trial, you'd actually succeed on the merits. Therefore, I'll give you the restraining order that you want. That's what that is about. So, in past years, judges who have reached similar findings have ordered new maps or had an expert draw them to ensure that coming elections were fair. But a shift in election law philosophy at the Supreme Court, combined with a new aggressiveness among Republicans who drew the maps, has upended that model for the elections in November. This time, all 4 states are using the rejected maps, and questions about their legality for future elections will be hashed out in court later. Great. Only later. How do you undo elections like this? And by the way, there was also some discussion by the Blue Virginia account on Twitter yesterday pointing this stuff out, that yes, we lost Elaine Luria along the way, but as Greg mentioned, her district redrawn with the intent by Republicans with the intent of getting her out. I mean, they were hoping to get her over a lot of people, and they, Abigail Spanberger among them, but she survived. Luria does not. By the way, I assume she lands a nice job somewhere in the Biden administration, but we'll see. Maybe she goes back to private sector. I don't know what her plans are. But at any rate, Blue Virginia pointing out, the districts that were drawn weren't necessarily, fair and in compliance with where Virginia voters had indicated they wanted things to come down. But as it turns out, there was, I think in the last election, we were asked to decide on a constitutional amendment, or I don't know, gosh, I don't remember the framing of it, but we were certainly asked to vote on a new plan for handling redistricting, which on close reading actually looked pretty stupid, because as I recall, it was like, well, if they can't come to a conclusion by the deadline date, then the maps will be drawn by a commission of equal parts, equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats. And it was just one of those, and then it would be reviewed by the state Supreme Court if that commission either couldn't settle things or whatever, or they didn't make enough progress. And it ultimately looked like, well, the bulk of the Supreme Court has at this point been appointed by Republican governors. And, aren't we going to just end up with a Republican map? And didn't we shoot ourselves in the foot having control of the legislature at the time by saying, well, we'll do things fairly and let a bipartisan commission decide and a court to back them up. But if the court's partisan, what's going to happen? And I was like, I'm not very happy with this actual option. I think I'm going to vote against this thing, but I lost and it won. And lo and behold, magically Republicans managed somehow to put an okay stamp on a map that eliminates Elaine Luria. And now she's gone. And Virginia doesn't even make this article. Just pointing that out. I'm going to see if I can dig up our note to self to look for the Blue Virginia thing. We'll see if I can remember that. Anyway, so where were we? The shift in election law philosophy at the Supreme Court, combined with the new aggressiveness among Republicans who drew the maps, has upended the model for elections in November. This time, all 4 states remember the states, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Ohio, using rejected maps, and the Supreme Court saying you can sue about it later if you think it's a problem. The immediate upshot, election experts say, is that Republicans almost certainly will gain more seats in midterm elections at a time when Democrats are already struggling to maintain their bare majority. David Wasserman, got mentioned earlier today, who follows congressional redistricting for the Cook Political Report, said that using rejected maps in these 4 states, which make up nearly 10% of the seats in the House, was likely to hand Republicans 5 to 7 House seats that they otherwise would not have won. Now, the results of last night certainly argue that, maybe had the contests been a little fairer and the seats been drawn a little fairer, there would have been even more Republican losses last night. But in some places, super aggressive pro-Republican gerrymanders saved at least 5 to 7 skins last night. Back to the story, we're seeing a revolution in courts' willingness to allow elections to go forward under illegal or unconstitutional rules. Isn't that what we have courts for? To make sure that illegal and unconstitutional stuff doesn't go forward? Well, what if they're all Republicans and they decide unconstitutional and illegal is better for Republicans, so let's just do it. Besides, if we say we can do it, then it's not unconstitutional. That's the definition. Well, that was Richard Hazen, who we hear from all the time, professor at the UCLA School of Law and the director of its Safeguarding Democracy project. It turns out, by the way, Safeguarding Democracy, actually a fairly popular agenda item last night, I think. Anyway, he says that's creating a situation in which states are getting one free illegal election before they have to change their rules. We have to live with the results of it for 2 years. Behind much of the change is the Supreme Court's embrace of an informal legal doctrine stating that judges should not order changes in election procedures too close to an actual election. In a 2006 case, Purcell versus Gonzalez, the court refused to stop an Arizona voter ID law from taking effect days before an election because that could result in voter confusion and consequent incentive to remain away from the polls. The Purcell principle, as it's called, offers almost no guidance beyond that. But the Supreme Court has significantly broadened its scope in this decade, mostly through rulings on applications that seek emergency relief, such as stays of lower court rulings, in which the justice's reasoning is often cryptic or even unexplained. And eventually they'll just stop saying anything at all. I keep mentioning. Conservatives say the Supreme Court's wariness of interfering with election preparations is common sense. It creates all kinds of logistical issues. Candidates don't know where they're running, said Michael A. Carvin, a lawyer at the firm Jones Day, who has handled redistricting cases for Republican clients in a host of states and helped lead the legal team supporting George W. Bush in the 2000 presidential election dispute. In case you were wondering where he comes from. By the way, that complaint, candidates don't know where they're running. Let's not forget that Hung Cao, who did just lose in Virginia's 10th district, spent a considerable amount of time campaigning in the wrong district, as it turns out. Door knocking in the neighboring, is it the 5th district that he ended up in? Walking around, I guess, Woodbridge, Virginia, which is well outside of the lines of his district because something, I don't know. So even when we allow them to keep illegal or unconstitutional maps in the hopes that it will minimize confusion by candidates and voters alike, it turns out to do no good. I mean, if you're dumb enough. Critics argue, though, that the court is effectively saying that a smoothly run election is more important than a just one. That's not so great. And they note that the long-standing guidance in redistricting cases from the court's historic one-person, one-vote ruling in 1964 is that using an illegal map in an election should be the unusual case. The Purcell doctrine is not always applied to Republicans' benefit. In March, the court cited an approaching primary election in refusing to block a North Carolina Supreme Court order undoing a Republican gerrymander of that state's congressional map. But scholars say such decisions are the exception. It just so happens that the unexplained rules in election cases have a remarkable tendency to save Republicans and hurt Democrats, said Stephen I. Vladek, a University of Texas law professor who addresses the issue in a forthcoming book, The Shadow Docket. It would be one thing if the court was giving us a compelling or even plausible explanation, he added, but the granting of a stay these days is often done with no explanation at all. The headline example came in January in Alabama, where a 3-judge federal panel said the state legislature had likely violated the Voting Rights Act by diluting black voters' power in its new map of the state's 7 House seats. The judges ordered the legislature to draw a new map exactly 4 months before the May primary elections, a stretch of time that not long ago another Supreme Court would have considered generous. But the Supreme Court, this Supreme Court anyway, issued an emergency stay, blocking the order 2 weeks later, restoring the rejected map for this election. Justice Brett Kavanaugh called the Purcell principle a bedrock tenet of election law. That's sudden. When an election is close at hand, the rules of the road must be clear and settled. In dissent, Justice Elena Kagan shot back, Alabama is not entitled to keep violating black Alabamians' voting rights just because the court's order came down in the first month of an election year. A month later, a federal judge in Georgia cited Mr. Kavanaugh's words in deciding not to order a new congressional map for that state. This time, 3 months before primary elections, even though he said the state legislature's map, like Alabama's, probably violated the Voting Rights Act. But that's okay because there's 3 months, and only 3 months. Anyway, in June, the Supreme Court blocked a lower court order for a new congressional map in Louisiana on the same grounds. The justices did not explain their reasoning there. Allowing elections using maps rejected by lower courts has been exceedingly rare in the last half-century. The principal instances occurred after the Supreme Court's one-person, one-vote ruling in 1964 forced the redrafting of political maps nationwide. Politicians have taken notice of the change. In Georgia, the Republican governor, Brian Kemp, waited 40 days after the legislature approved a congressional map before signing it into law, leaving a sliver of time for the succeeding court battle. You see what happened there? He realizes what the court's been doing. He gets handed a new map. It's right on the line. Maybe there's 5 months before the election, and they'll say that's enough time to order new maps. Well, what I'll do is I'll wait to sign the legislation implementing the new maps for 40 days. So now there's only 4 months left. And that seems to be about where they draw the line. And what do you know? That is where they drew the line when the case got there. The relevant actors are well aware of both Purcell and the court's inconsistent application of it, Professor Vladeck said. So there's plenty of upside and very little downside to try to manipulate the circumstances as much as possible. Wow. So they gerrymander the maps and then they game when they sign the gerrymandered maps so that it falls under, arguably, this Purcell principle, and they can use illegal maps at least once and gain some kind of an advantage. And then if they're ever forced by courts to redraw those maps, at least they have a number of incumbents in those seats running for re-election and are not challenging for them. And they get 2 years to, investigate Hunter Biden, I suppose, is what they say they're going to do with it. Slow-walking redistricting issues is not confined to federal courts. In Ohio, both congressional and legislative elections this year are being run under maps that the state Supreme Court has ruled are unconstitutional partisan gerrymanders. They made it all the way to the Supreme Court. Clear decision made. It's not a matter of, it's too close to the election for us to do anything. They did it. But it ended up not mattering because, the rest of the article explains, the GOP-led Ohio Redistricting Commission, which drew the rejected maps, was threatened with contempt for foot-dragging in producing maps of state legislature districts. It waited nearly 7 weeks this spring to produce a second congressional map after the state Supreme Court rejected the first one. A 3-judge federal panel later imposed the Redistricting Commission's state legislative maps this spring, citing looming election deadlines. The state Supreme Court, again, rejected the second congressional map as a partisan gerrymander, but in July, after a long trial and after months and months after the map had been used in the state's primary election in May. What happened in Ohio is an especially egregious flouting of the rule of law, purely for partisan advantage and contrary to what the state's voters wanted with redistricting reform, said Ned Foley, an Ohio State University law professor and a leading election law expert. How do you know what they wanted with redistricting reform? Of course, they had a vote on a constitutional amendment about redistricting reform, and fair and balanced and nonpartisan drawing of the lines is what they asked for, but magically, somehow, not what they got. Just as other states previously have said, we want to expand Medicare, Medicaid, and the legislature says, that isn't what you said, at least as far as I'm concerned. We're going to do the opposite. But there it is. It's outright defiance of democracy and a warning sign for the rest of the nation on how ugly and dangerous this kind of power grabbing can be. So another interesting thing wrapped up in all of this, right? Oh, well, we saved democracy, or the system worked, or maybe all of this stuff about the democracy being in danger was a bad idea and not quite right. Or, the opposite view of, well, everybody responded to it pretty well and you did historically outperformed everybody. Don't you think that might have had something to do with it? And the interesting irony here being that by defying democracy and saying, no, your redistricting reform constitutional amendment won't be honored, and we're going to defy the Supreme Court, thereby preserving illegal, unconstitutional maps based on which we're now going to hold elections. And guess what? We might have also eked out a win and a majority in the United States House of Representatives as a result. And couldn't we just say, gosh, it's too late. We'll have to let those results lie for 2 years. We'll see what we do with that. We'll head into the next presidential election with 2 years of momentum under this illegal and unconstitutional map. But what are you going to do, right? It's not like we're ignoring democracy and defying democracy. That was all just hyperbole, don't you know? You won the election on it, sure, but you know how Democrats are. They're constantly lying about litter boxes and fentanyl. You see how it is. Every accusation is a confession. All right, we'll be back in 2 minutes. We'll finish this article, cover a couple other topics as well.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on At Roots Radio. Let's conclude the reading of the New York Times piece that was appended to Steve Vladek's tweet, and I guess now you know how he became aware of the Times piece. He's in it, but that frequently happens with him because he's in every piece. All right, let's see. Where did we leave off with this before we jumped off and did some extra commentary? Yes. What happened in Ohio being the especially egregious flouting of the rule of law purely for partisan advantage and contrary to what the state's voters wanted with redistricting reform. According to Ned Foley, the Ohio State University law professor and leading election law expert, it's an outright defiance of democracy and a warning sign for the rest of the nation on how ugly and dangerous this kind of power grabbing can be. Just like the January 3rd power grabbing I've been outlining as a nightmare scenario to come. Critics say they agree that practical issues matter when elections are imminent, but the Supreme Court is putting next to no weight on the democratic harms caused by unlawful district maps, while it overstates the administrative inconvenience of redrawing districts. It's a good way of putting it. That's from Nicholas Stephanopoulos, an election law scholar at Harvard University. There is, however, one other potential explanation for allowing the use of rejected maps in November. Some election law experts speculate that the court intends to reverse lower court decisions striking down the Alabama and Louisiana maps after it hears a crucial elections case in October, which I guess they've heard and not yet decided. The Voting Rights Act clause invoked in those cases, known as Section 2, is used mostly to pursue racial bias in political maps. Mr. Carvin, the Jones Day lawyer, said he fully expected the court to take aim at it this term. The reality on the ground has changed dramatically since the act was passed, he said, citing the election of politicians like former President Barack Obama with broad support among white voters. The Pavlovian requirement that states with a history of racial discrimination need to automatically max out the number of minority-majority districts is no longer the law. Critics of the court say it very much is the law, seeing as federal judges in Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana have said so this year. And that's why maps deemed in violation of it should have been replaced, Professor Stephanopoulos said. But he also said he believed Mr. Carvin's prediction was probably correct. And so it's the law for now, but might later become not the law. Poof, we were all just wrong about that. But at the moment, the courts below were applying the law correctly. Why not let them handle business closer to home? Why is the Supreme Court stepping in from Washington to say you lower court judges who are closer to the action and in the state, in many cases, where the redistricting is happening, yes, you say it's illegal, but we say, well, the thing is, you said it was illegal at the wrong time of the month here, the wrong time of the year. The timing stinks. We just can't help you with that. We're going to have illegal, unconstitutional elections that unconstitutionally disadvantage targeted minority groups. And, you can sue to fix it later. That's your big remedy. But by the way, we're going to throw your suit out because we don't believe there's any such thing as racial discrimination anymore because Barack Obama was once president. Now, we elected Donald Trump in reaction to that and gave permission to become racist again to everyone, and it can now become racist in public again. Racism doesn't exist, though, as far as we know, because hey, I'm not wearing a MAGA hat, so that's the end of racism. Okay, sure. That's one way of looking at things. All right, let's see. Other things to cover here. And what else did I put aside for sharing today? Let's see. There's this. I had mentioned that Michigan had such tremendous Democratic performance, and just by way of summing it all up, I have the tweet from Jonathan Cohen from the HuffPost, who says, not sure people grasp the totality or history of what Democrats won in Michigan last night. He will help us grasp it with little check marks. Governor, the governor's race, Attorney General, Secretary of State, one on the abortion questions that were on the ballot, and key U.S. House races. And now it looks like they've flipped the Senate, the state Senate, and House, which would be really, truly historic, compared to free Michigan and kidnap your governor and invade your state capital the way you did with the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. All of that was happening in an attempt to make it look like everything was going the opposite direction. But when the voters got a chance to speak about it, they actually said, through peaceful means, we'd actually like everything to be the other way. And if you end up seeing things manifesting in the opposite direction, it's because crazy people, a minority of crazy people with guns, have showed up to demand that there not be democracy in Michigan. And hey, there's a whole article of the Constitution that says you kind of have to guarantee that kind of government to us after all. So anyway, just wanted to give you Jonathan Cohen's quick rundown of exactly what happened and how broad the reach for Democrats was in that state. We also have, there was a story briefly at the top of people's pages yesterday while the polls were still open that might have been of some consequence, but I don't know. No indication yet that the results in Florida were changed in any way because of this, although I do note for the record that we all were talking, or at least I was, repeating other people's talking about Florida being somehow an outlier in all of this, pardon me, and that that their results there weren't matched around the country, though Republicans will start looking at it and saying, oh, well, maybe we ought to be doing whatever they're doing in Florida if we can replicate it. But this sort of side note, it caught my eye during the day anyway. Florida and Missouri, which nobody's talking about, tell Justice Department voting monitors to stay outside polling places. Apparently the Justice Department sent monitors. I don't know if they sent them everywhere, But the ones they sent to Florida and Missouri they were looking to have a confrontation and send them away. Federal monitors would need local permission, they said, to observe activity inside election sites. Tim Craig, Perry Stein, and Jacob Bogage, I don't know how he says, Bogage, reporting this story. Maybe I should stop giving people credit. Go look it up yourself instead of making me try to pronounce it. The administration of Governor Ron DeSantis, has refused to allow Justice Department election monitors to go inside polling locations. That's kind of what they do. In South Florida, I don't know about the rest of Florida, saying in a letter that the federal government's involvement would be, quote, counterproductive and, quote, potentially undermine confidence in the election. That's rather backwards. On Monday, the Justice Department announced that it would send monitors to 64 jurisdictions nationwide, up from 44 jurisdictions in 2020, to evaluate how elections are being conducted amid a wave of threats to election workers and politicians and allegations of voter intimidation. Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties were all slated to receive federal monitors from the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. Federal monitors were also sent to some Florida localities in 2020 during the Trump administration, but they remained outside because of the coronavirus pandemic. Brad McVeigh, the chief counsel for the Florida Department of State, said in a letter issued late Monday that those monitors would not be allowed inside the polling places this year under Florida law. McVeigh said the Florida Secretary of State's office, which is overseen by DeSantis, considered a likely contender for the 2020 or 2024 presidential race, would instead send its own monitors to those three counties, which are among the most populous and Democratic-leaning counties in Florida. See how dangerous that could be. Florida, and I'm, I have no proof of anything, but I will note for the record that the most Democratic-leaning and most populous counties in Florida not only didn't get federal election monitors, but got instead DeSantis dispatched election monitors, quote unquote election monitors. I don't know if they did anything, but then all of a sudden it turns out while the Republicans got their asses handed to them nationwide, they did extraordinarily well in Florida somehow, maybe because they're popular there. I don't know. Florida statutes list the people who, quote, may enter any polling room or polling place, McVeigh wrote. Department of Justice personnel are not included on the list. I don't know what the list says, though. Maybe the list says, duly authorized government personnel. But hey, while the Justice Department is permitted to place monitors inside polling locations, the department must receive permission from local elections officials to do so, according to Sean Morales Doyle, director of the Voting Rights Program at the Brennan Center for Justice, a nonprofit law and public policy institute. So I guess maybe that's correct. The Justice Department has said it followed standard procedure on Tuesday and has monitors positioned outside polling locations in Florida and Missouri, where state officials also said the federal representatives would not be welcome inside. Morales Doyle said it is typical for the Justice Department to position its monitors, all of whom are lawyers, either inside or outside polling locations, depending on what they are observing. A monitor observing whether a location is accessible to people with disabilities, for example, may be stationed inside. One focused on potential voter intimidation could be outside. The fact that Florida is saying they do not want monitors in their polling locations is not in conflict with how the law works, Morales Doyle said. I do not think it is the right decision to say they cannot come in, but I do think that elections officials can say who they want in their polling places. Before 2013, under the Voting Rights Act, the Justice Department had the authority to dispatch workers to observe voting inside polling places at localities that had histories of racial discrimination in their voting process, but the department lost that authority after a Supreme Court ruling that year struck down portions of the voting rights law. In a news release announcing where monitors would be sent this year, the Justice Department noted that it had observed local election procedures nationwide since 1965. Republicans have waged a sustained campaign against alleged voter fraud over the past 2 years, despite scant evidence of fraud in the 2020 election. Elections officials in battleground states are anticipating delayed results and protracted fights once the polls close Tuesday night, We're still not out of those woods, by the way. Missouri officials on Friday denied the Justice Department's request to conduct Election Day inspections under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Voting Rights Act. Secretary of State John Ashcroft, remember him? This is his son, I guess, reiterated that stance in a meeting on Monday. He told the Washington Post that the Justice Department's presence amounted to a bid to, quote, bully a local election authority and could intimidate and suppress the vote. How so? Well, we'll never know. Ashcroft and Cole County Clerk Steve Korsmeyer, also a Republican, told federal officials they would not be permitted to observe polling places on Tuesday. On Tuesday, Justice Department observers were stationed outside polling places in Cole County, home to the state capital, Jefferson City. This is not the Voting Rights Act. This is the Americans with Disabilities Act. What's next? They're going to want to be at elections because they want to check that insulation in the building was purchased from China in the 1970s? Give me a break, Ashcroft said in a phone interview. Yeah, I'm sure that's coming next. Ashcroft, whose father, John Ashcroft, served as Attorney General in the George W. Bush administration, compared Justice Department officials from the U.S. Attorney's Office of the Western District of Missouri to jackbooted thugs and to armed individuals in Arizona who have been seen patrolling ballot drop boxes. That's interesting. I think we've already had lawsuits around the country about individuals around polling places. Well, unauthorized non-governmental personnel in tactical gear versus suited lawyers from the Justice Department. Come on. Anyway, we've had lawsuits around the country about individuals around polling places, and they were told that they had to stay away from them because they could intimidate voters. Justice Department officials last observed Missouri elections in 2016 at polling places in St. Louis. In other parts of the country, including red-leaning Texas, state officials were welcoming Justice Department help in dealing with potential voting issues. Sam Taylor, a spokesman for Texas Secretary of State John Scott, Republican, said his office was working closely with the Justice Department to monitor voting in Beaumont, Texas, where a black voter and the NAACP have alleged harassment of black voters by white poll workers. Separate from the Election Monitors Program, FBI special agents serving as election crime coordinators are on duty Tuesday in the Bureau's 56 field offices to receive voting-related complaints from the public, according to the Justice Department. Employees in the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division will also operate a hotline all day on Election Day, answering calls from people who spot possible violations of federal voting rights laws. So, of interest, and, not entirely clear on the issue that anything wrong or unconstitutional happening, and they can monitor elections from the outside, but it's an interesting theory under which they're excluding the Department of Justice. That they might also want to check the building code doesn't sound like a really good excuse to me. All right, let's see. So speaking of that issue, which didn't really come to fruition yesterday, there's still, of course, plenty of opportunity for Republican election denialism, and I guess it's beginning to take shape in Arizona, among other places, where Kari Lake, it sounds like, will, lose the election. And I guess we'll start to see just how much, like we said, how much juice is still left in the tank of the election deniers. Arizona becoming a focal point for the next big lie. I just happened to have picked up this article from MSNBC, thanks to my brother Mark, who sent it on, and thought, I think correctly, that this needed to be a part of our collection for today's show. Right-wing politicians and commentators are using disinformation, can you imagine, to manufacture scandal in the battleground state. Let's see what's going on. It's fresh this morning from Zishan Alim, MSNBC opinion columnist, who writes, in the run-up to Tuesday's elections, MAGA Republicans spread disinformation and ginned up suspicion to prime their base to believe Democrats could rig the midterm elections. When Election Day came, they immediately seized on the first opportunity to attempt what could amount to the new big lie. It's the same big lie, of course. Malfunctioning voting machines in Arizona. That's where they'll They'll start out, I guess. There is no evidence that anything untoward happened in Maricopa County, where Republicans administer elections, by the way, but that's beside the point. MAGA politicians, pundits, and activists are in the business of looking for any kind of irregularity to claim the opposition is engaging in foul play and try to disenfranchise their political movement. The effect of this cynical mission to manufacture fake crises is to create a mandate for disenfranchising the voting public. The pro-Trump right engaged in chaotic and contradictory messaging about what was happening with voting machines in Arizona and what should be done about it. But that was secondary to a bigger mission, creating a shroud of controversy and scandal around voting in Arizona with the mission of claiming another rigged election. Republicans can then blame foul play for any losses, or say they heroically overcame attempts at subterfuge if they win. Either way, the legitimacy of American democratic institutions takes another blow. On Tuesday morning, reports emerged that tabulation devices at 20 to 30% of voting locations in Maricopa County were exhibiting technical problems. That was, of course, a significant problem, but it wasn't an unmanageable one. Maricopa County's Board of Supervisors chairman, Bill Gates, believe it or not, explained that voters had three options: wait for their machines to come back online, place their ballots in a secure box to be counted, or go to alternative polling locations. While it seems there will be delays in counting ballots in the county because of this issue, Gates, a Republican, said there are no concerns about inaccurate vote counts. Republicans immediately filed requests for emergency relief, calling for polling stations to stay open for an extra 3 hours because of the malfunctioning of the tabulation devices, which really doesn't make any particular sense. I mean, unless the tabulation devices are the scanner sheets and they count the votes just as they process them, which is possible. But still, even so, like, there's really no reason to leave the polling stations open, right? You get to cast your ballot. That has nothing to do with the tabulating of it. You have until, I don't know, let's say 8 o'clock. I don't know when polls close in Arizona, but you have until 8 o'clock to cast your ballot, and then we count them. Now, we can count them during the day as well by having you feed your ballot into a Scantron reading device the way we do here in Virginia. Or we can just have you drop it in a box and we can tabulate it later. But either way, there was nothing preventing people who wanted to get to the polls to cast their ballot before 8 o'clock from doing it. Nothing about the tabulation machines really would block that. Unless, of course, you're standing around fumbling like, well, and that's why the one of the other options was to put your ballot in a box and lock it up and have it be tabulated later. I guess the procedure here in Virginia, you go, you get your ballot, you fill it out, and then you turn in your ballot by feeding it into a machine, which also tabulates it. And I guess if the machine breaks down, you know, at least the first couple of voters for whom the machine breaks down, the workers try to fix it and they stand around and say, well, what should we do with these ballots? But then the practical answer eventually is going to be, well, the machine we have doesn't work. So therefore, let us collect your ballots and lock them up and put them in a box. Fine. And that may create a small backup, even at the busiest time, of people waiting to find out what's going to happen to my ballot. But after that, no, it doesn't create any more delays. What do you need another 3 hours for? Anyway, a Maricopa County Superior Court judge rejected that request, probably for that reason. As Lisa Rubin, the off-air legal analyst for MSNBC's Rachel Maddow's show, explained, Republicans failed to include evidence in the supporting affidavits that any voter in Maricopa County was denied the right to vote as a result of tabulation errors in Maricopa County machines, because provisional ballots were available to people who complained about malfunctioning devices. So, okay, fine. Nobody lost their ability to vote because of the machines, the tabulating machines breaking down. But by the way, let me also just call out here the irony of seeing Republicans move to sue to keep the polls open because everybody deserves the chance to vote. I mean, they do, and it's great, but they used to say that was sore loser politics. Sore loser, man, you're end the vote, stop the count, stop the steal. Well, this time it didn't work for them, so they just gimme-tarianed their way to a different position. The opposite one. Voting machines shouldn't be malfunctioning, and irregularities shouldn't happen. But small numbers of these things are inevitable in most elections, particularly in a country as big as this one. But what's important is there's no evidence that the irregularities were the result of malice, nor is there evidence that they blocked large numbers of people from voting because alternatives were available. Nonetheless, the MAGA right pounced on the opportunity. Republican gubernatorial candidate Kari Lake spread misinformation, claiming machines were malfunctioning only in Republican areas. Former President Donald Trump released a video message warning that a lot of bad things were afoot and claimed that they want to delay you out of voting. Hard right activists like Turning Point USA founder Charlie Kirk made up false claims about long waits across Maricopa County and an election process sabotaged by Democrats. And right-wing authoritarian media outlets had a field day floating evidence-free narratives of a nefarious conspiracy. Embedded here is Judd Legum's tweet taking stock of this, that Aaron Rupar had captured a video of Kari Lake saying, there's going to be a come to Jesus. Kari Lake is holding a press conference or press gaggle where she's already nodding toward conspiracies about election results in Arizona. Judd noting Fox News now giving Kari Lake airtime to spread conspiracy theories. Of course they would do that. The Republican messaging about what Maricopa County voters should do wasn't well coordinated. An inaccurate tweet from Lake reveals she either didn't understand or didn't want to understand what needed to be done to ensure that people with malfunctioning machines could have their votes counted. By now, we should be well versed in this ploy. Making sure Republican votes are fairly counted isn't the point when it comes to Republican claims of voter fraud. The point for them is to smear the very idea of functional democracy. Let's keep an eye on how this manufactured crisis is invoked as results from Arizona's closely watched races emerge. She's way behind, as I understand it, in the count. We'll see whether she has the gas in the tank to actually try and pull off a big lie 2.0. All right, nearing the end of our broadcast day today, handing things off, of course, as usual, to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, but not quite yet. Let's see. Yesterday, during the day, Politico was already reporting on Republican activists and candidates setting the stage to claim that elections they lose are stolen. Let's see if they had any particular people in mind. The advice they are giving voters, according to Politico, to vote late on election day would cause the counting delays they say are suspicious. We kind of went over that ground. Anything new about that one? Probably not. It looks like that's the idea. They were reiterating the Republican theory that if they push their people to vote in person but do it late, it would clog things up and maybe turn people around and cause, at the very minimum, cause delays in counting the vote. If even if the people didn't turn around, I guess that was the other thing about it. If you cause a long line, you might be discouraging what they think are Democratic voters from voting. But of course, most of us have been trained, if you're in line before the polls close, they have to let you vote. A lot of people actually do know that these days. But it also means that the polling place stays open an extra 2 to 3 to 6 hours to accommodate all the people who are in line, which means that they can't start their counting until 2, 3, 6 hours after everybody else, which means there are delays in the count, which means Republicans have the opportunity to claim that there's shenanigans going on. So it might actually work even if nobody turns around. I had forgotten about that theory. All right. Let's see. Anything else that we should try and squeeze in before the end of today's show? No, I think everything else is from before the election. So not entirely election related. So we'll leave it for further exploration later, except to say, I guess I'll call out, one, Joe Rogan, who had earlier jumped on the litter boxes in schools lie, has apparently had to admit at some point, I think I got it wrong about that. He had done so on the basis of anecdotal evidence. So totally, I know somebody, a buddy of mine's got a wife who's a teacher in the schools and she totally saw it. And apparently he's had to backtrack on that and say, yeah, I don't think that was right. I don't think that actually happened. It doesn't change much. And, whatever. Rogan remains Rogan, I guess. And something I want to share with you perhaps tomorrow. Investigators search for pricey gifts to Trump from foreign leaders. In other words, once again, the National Archives, who's supposed to track not only the presidential paperwork, but all the gifts that are presented to a president so that they don't violate the emoluments clause. It turns out several of the valuable, shiny objects to which Trump was treated by foreign governments are not among the objects currently in the hands of the people at the archives. And golly, just like the classified information that was in those envelopes, they don't know where they are. And I have some idea of where they are. They're in Trump's pockets because he doesn't understand that stuff. And he's like, they gave the gifts directly to me. What else could they possibly be but personal possessions? Well, anyway, it turns out golf clubs, diamond earrings, and that crazy soccer ball that Putin gave to Trump are among the gifts that House Oversight has asked the National Archives to find, and guess what? Nobody can find them. Perhaps we'll read the details of that one tomorrow. In the meantime, as I said, time to turn things over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Let's see what he's got on tap today. We got a little more time for it. Voters voted against Dobbs. Oh, let me see if I can do this over again. Voters voting against Dobbs, deniers, and Donald lifted the Dems in midterms. I like that turn of phrase. On the rest of the menu, the Supreme Court seemed unlikely to agree to overturn decades of precedent in a case about civil rights lawsuits. Over 1 million Americans with diabetes rationed their insulin in the past year. Maybe we should do something about that. And Colgate University is returning 1,500 funerary artifacts to the Oneida Indian Nation. How do you like that? After the break, I'll move on to the chef's table, where hackers published the personal medical records of over 10 million customers after Australian health insurer Medibank refused to pay a ransom. Yikes, ransomware strikes again. More after this.
NetworksRadio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Well, if you've had enough of American elections, perhaps you'd like to check in with the folks over in UK, where a senior government member resigned after mounting allegations that he bullied colleagues. That is, they were mounting against him. He wasn't mounting against them, though that would be bullying too. I don't know. We'll unravel this next and see you tomorrow.